serious. People who were now married because you didn't know how to break up with your SO. How's that going for you? Story 1. We met in May, married in October. We divorced after 6 years and had 2 kids. She wanted the marriage, pushed for it. I didn't say no. I wanted to be married, have kids, own a home, all those things. I wasn't sure if I should have been with her, though. There were some red flags, but I hadn't found my voice yet, and I didn't advocate for myself. She wanted to be married. She was 4 years older and had already picked out a dress, and since I wasn't backing out, she decided that I was the one. The first year was good, then I saw the cracks in her lies. I suspected she cheated on me. She previously said that she'd cheated on every boyfriend she'd ever had, one of those red flags, and things just weren't adding up. Her going for a walk with our neighbor at 12:30 a.m. and not coming home till 5 a.m. We tried to work things through, went to counseling for a year or so, and I was still fighting for that life, married, wife, kids, and happiness. Then I didn't get into a commissioning program in the Army. Our relationship went downhill quickly after that, and I moved out. A trial separation. We'd picked up counseling again, and all those issues were mine, my communication, my parenting. Then I found concrete proof she cheated 2 years into our marriage with an entirely different person, and she was continuing multiple relationships while still, quote-unquote, working on us. That next counseling session, I dropped the bomb that for the last 10 or so sessions was all about my issues. What about this guy who happened to be her first cousin, or that guy, or this guy? Surely, if you want to make it work, you wouldn't be sending to these other guys. The therapist asked if I could work through this to refocus our sessions or if I still loved her. No and no. I was tired of the lies and gaslighting. Story 2. I'll add my story to the mix. He and I had a very tumultuous relationship for the first few years together due to emotional immaturity and trauma on both our parts. He was my quote-unquote rebound after my first true heartbreak, and we started dating way too soon. We fought often, broke up once or twice, and I constantly thought about leaving even after we had moved in together. Still, I'd grown dependent on him in ways I now see were unhealthy, and while I did have feelings for him, part of me was just scared of being alone. When he shocked me by popping the question, my stomach dropped and I physically wanted to run. Every fiber in my body was yelling, no, no, no at that moment, but his proposal speech was just so beautiful and heartfelt, and he was so vulnerable and open that I muttered a bewildered yes before I could even process my own feelings. Having to call our parents immediately to share the news was just torture. Honestly, looking back on that moment, I have no idea why I wasn't honest with him, but there was a part of me that did love and care for him, and I wanted, I don't know exactly, but I wanted to see if we could work things out and be together, even though it all felt so hopeless and wrong. We've been together for 8 years now, married 4, and I'm so happy to say that we are the perfect partners for each other. We've both grown so much on our own through sheer will and hard work, and in that process, we've also grown together in ways I could have never imagined. He's the most insightful, self-aware man I've ever met, and he loves me more than I ever felt I deserved. And through him, I learned how to love, genuinely and to the best of my abilities, selflessly. He truly is my other half in life, and without him, I'd be so lost. I'm so grateful that the part of me that was scared and hopeless and wanted to run away screaming decided to stay, to wait and see if we could grow together, to see what life we could build together. The journey has been more painful and more difficult than anything I've ever faced, but it's also been the most precious and humbling and life-affirming experience in every way. As a wise man once said, the greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return. Story 3. All of the top comments are people pointing out the positive outcomes of their situation. I feel that it would be wrong for me to not share my story, which kind of turned out differently. I knew from a couple months into the relationship that I didn't love her. She came from a terrible home situation and she was severely depressed with a borderline personality disorder to boot. I felt so sorry for her. I honestly worried that if I left her, she would commit suicide. She had 2 little girls who needed someone stable and normal in their lives. I was afraid that I would be letting them down if I left. Who else was going to help them if I didn't? Before we got married, she cheated on me, but she was in such denial about it that she managed to convince me that it didn't happen. Although looking back on it, I know it's true. We fought almost daily. We screamed at each other and she would get so angry that she would take things that were important to us, shared symbols of our love and affection like her wedding rings, our marriage certificate, gifts that I'd bought for her, and attempt to destroy them or throw them away. I wasn't at all interested in hooking up with her, and most of the time I wasn't able to force myself. She could sense that there was something wrong in our relationship, and she constantly made comments to me about how much I didn't love her and didn't want to be with her. Towards the end, our fighting got so bad that it was just sometimes physical. Never punching or hitting, but a lot of shoving and grabbing one another. I felt like I was losing control of myself. I did end up in therapy and had a relapse. I am a recovering addict and had been clean for 3 years when she and I got together. After we had been married for a while, she started bringing men around, quote unquote, friends from work. She swore that nothing was happening with them, and by this point, I was so detached from reality that I honestly didn't care one way or the other. I finally had a breakthrough in therapy where I realized that her reaction to how I live my life is not my problem. We split up and I spent the next 6 months spiraling deeper into my addiction before I started to come out of it. I've since remarried, someone I do love with all my heart, but I still have nightmares. And this is not hyperbole, actually real life nightmares. My current wife will tell me some mornings about how I was screaming in my sleep that I am still stuck in that horrible, abusive, loveless relationship. There simply isn't enough time for me to adequately express all of the different ramifications of that relationship. There was only one positive thing that came out of it, and that was that I learned that you cannot, quote unquote, settle for a relationship. The person with whom you intend to spend your life has to be someone who meets all of your criteria, or you'll just never be happy with them. The negative consequences, on the other hand, are apparent in my everyday life, even now. In my relationships with other people, especially my current wife, my finances, and my own general psychological well being. So please, don't stay with someone unless you are sure. Story 4. This will probably get buried, but oh well. We moved in together after 6 months of dating simply because he was the first guy I had dated who actually had his life together, and I was so desperate to leave my parents' house. He made everything about me, the sex, our dates, our vacations, etc. I'd never been in a relationship where I was considered a priority. It was absolutely perfect, quirky, but perfect in my eyes. He was older by 3 years and had the work ethic of a horse. He was going to work and provide for others until the day he died. No doubt about it. After a year of living together, and things were great. We communicated well, the sex was fantastic, and we lived for one another, and it was perfect. He proposed, and I said yes, and 6 months into our engagement, my parents arranged an intervention sort of meeting and told me it was about the failing relationship between my brother and me. He was in an emotionally abusive relationship, and she had led him to drink, which led him to become an alcoholic, and my parents refused to believe me. So at this intervention, my family proceeds to tell me how they don't want this wonderful man in my life to join our family. They think I'm making a mistake because nobody is that genuine and he just comes across as fake and we don't like how open he is. This came after they promised our budget for our wedding and gave us an ultimatum to either have the budget for a wedding or a down payment on a house. So I cried, I pondered, and I cried some more. And I started to doubt all of the motives behind his actions. I came up with these weird alternative motives and started doubting all of his intentions. But then he asked me 2 months later if I would marry him on New Year's Eve. 2 weeks, no dress, no friends, just closest family. I told him I didn't want my family there and only his. He says, "The only way I'm going to marry you is in the presence of your family. You respect your parents too much to not have them there." And so I told my mom what our plans were, and she immediately asked me, "Are you pregnant? Why the rush? I don't understand why you're in such a hurry to throw your life away." And I wanted to run. I wanted to not marry him and not talk to my parents and just disappear. I felt so alone until I got home that night and he held me. I didn't even have to tell him what happened because he just knew the conversation didn't go well with my mom. And that's when I realized that you don't pick your parents, but you get to pick your significant other. And that's who you need to be happy with because that's who you spend the rest of your life with. And I realized that he respected my wishes more than my parents respected them. So I told my parents where we would be getting married, and if they wanted to be there, we would be getting married at 3 o'clock. So we get to my future in-laws' house, and they have gutted their home of all furniture and turned their dining room into an altar for us. They stripped their house of all Christmas decorations and tied bows in our wedding colors that would have been, had we kept our original plan. They set up chairs and linens and tables and centerpieces of my favorite flowers in their living room, which has been converted into a reception area. They made dinner for 40 people, combined with my family and his. He grew up Mormon with 8 siblings. Then my family starts to show up. My parents were the first to arrive. They walk in and see what my in-laws have done, and my mom starts to cry. The first time in 10 years that she shed a tear, and she realized just what kind of environment I was marrying into. One that was loving and accepting and supportive. She was angry with herself for wanting to convince me otherwise, and so I said, I do, in spite of them. Now, a year and a half later, my husband and I have completed our 5-year plan. We completed it in 10 months. This involved buying a house, paying off 2 cars, and consolidating all of our credit card debt so that we could prepare for children. I've learned how to cook and experiment with recipes. I have this incredible support system in the form of my in laws and husband. He's pushed me to find my career and it has taken off like crazy. And I am so thankful I decided to spite my parents and not run. I've never been happier. I'm so proud I didn't let the opinion of my parents alter my view as so many people do. I started down that path and I went against my doubts and trusted my gut, and I'm in a much, much better place for it. Story 5. He was my friend with benefits. He got mad when I stopped sleeping together when I started seriously dating another guy, but I agreed to go out on a date with a friend with benefits before we quote-unquote broke up. He was very good-looking, intimidated me at first. He was also arrogant and I hated that. He hadn't been in a serious relationship before. It took probably 6 months for him and me to make that transition from a friend with benefits to a relationship. I wanted to break up with him on like a daily basis, but then I would see him trying pretty hard to let go of his arrogance and be a good boyfriend. I felt like if I broke up with him, it'd ruin him for life and he'd never have a functional long-term relationship. After about 6 months though, he finally let his guard down. He's still confident and kind of bossy, but not an arrogant prick like he used to be. I think I loved him prior to that point, but not in a consuming forever kind of way. We got married many, many, many years ago. We have a child, and I cannot imagine living without him. He's an elemental part of my life, and I adore him. Story 6. We made the choice to stay for the kid when I became pregnant at 17. Even on my wedding day, all I wanted to do was run away. I didn't want it, but I knew I couldn't make ends meet on my own, and he was a great dad even as young as we were. It's been 8 years now, and I can't say things have always been perfect. We really had a lot of growing up to do, but I'm so happy to have him by my side. We built our lives from the ground up, and it's been a privilege. We fought and nearly split up a couple times, but we always came back to each other. He's my best friend, and I really don't want to spend my time with anyone but him. About a year ago, I actually found out he didn't want to get married either. He wanted to run away just as much as I did, so that was pretty interesting because one of the reasons I didn't want to leave was because I didn't want to break his heart. Turns out he was thinking the same thing. Story 7. I don't have stars in my eyes when I look at him, but I think he does for me. Anything I want to do is what he wants to do too, and not just to humor me. He seems to genuinely enjoy doing whatever it is that will make me happy. With time, I've come to appreciate him more and more to the point that now I don't know what I'd do without him. But I often think that he deserves someone better than me. He deserves someone who will look at him the same way he looks at me. Story 8. Shit. I've been alienated from all my friends and I'm basically on house arrest under constant watch, unable to use my phone without being questioned, and am unable to take part in some of the things that gave me joy. For example, smoking a joint on a Friday night. I'm allowed out to work my 60-hour weeks though. Meanwhile, she has a great social life, goes out and uses her phone constantly, has been caught cheating twice with the same guy and will randomly stop all forms of housework and explode at me for doing nothing after a 15-hour shift. This weekend, she had me driving all weekend and I cooked 4 days in a row, asked her what she was doing for dinner and got told to screw off. I found out I had a brother and a sister from my dad's side, met him once, age 12, dead now, and shortly after meeting them for the first time went behind my back and began begging them for money. We didn't need it, and they promptly dropped all contact with me. That was fun. Oh, and the sex is probably on average every 6 to 8 weeks, not that I care much anymore. I've been reduced to working in online gaming. She has totally removed my independence and masculinity. I think the only reason I stick around is that she has systematically destroyed me as a person, and it's just easier this way. I honestly wouldn't know how to escape the deep roots she's implanted in me. It's okay though, I enjoy gaming, I guess. Story 9. Probably the best decision I ever made. 3 years ago, I was so certain she was not the one for me simply because I was bored and wished I could kiss someone else. Well, one beautiful road trip vacation was all it took for me to realize we are perfectly meant to be together. We've been married almost 2 years and together 6. I couldn't be happier that I stuck it out, and I'm confident in saying she is the one for me. Story 10. I was dating an Australian dude for a couple of years. I'm American, and we exhausted all the visitor visas we could visiting one another. Eventually, it came down to if we wanted to be together, we had to get married. We dated for a long time and I loved each other, but neither of us really had marriage as a priority. So we sat down, wrote a pros and cons list, and decided getting married was the best thing for us. However, over the time we spent dating, he stopped doing a few things, like showering. When he moved back to the States as my fiancé, I noticed just the smell of him was overpowering. I caught him at one point saying he had just showered and didn't need one, but he actually hadn't showered in 2 weeks. He'd go down and swim in the apartment pool and count that as a shower. The summertime, I'm pretty sure he showered even less. I can't emphasize enough how bad it was. I literally had to throw away my couch because the stink seeped into it and I couldn't get it out. I discovered earlier in our relationship that he didn't know how to blow his nose. I tried to show him, but he said he couldn't do it and would just pick his nose and wipe it on the desk. Got him to at least wipe it on a tissue, but he stopped doing that and wiped it on a wall near his desk where I couldn't see and would have the pleasure of discovering later. He also couldn't work in the States at this point, so he said he'd keep up the apartment while I worked. Yeah, he didn't. He wouldn't clean anything he thought I'd touched. The apartment was in squalor and filled with gnats and flies and a mountain of shipping boxes from his habit of ordering online. I eventually just bought paper plates and stuff and only used those, so he couldn't say I used any dishes and I could keep on him to clean up his own mess. Suffice to say, by the time the date to be married came around, I didn't want to. But he sold everything he owned in Australia. He owned his own apartment there and had his own car. He quit his job. I couldn't just send him back and not feel like a monster for not trying. So I tried. We got married. It was predictably awful. I spent a lot of nights staying at work until midnight, just drawing alone on my tablet so I could have some peace away from him. He was supposed to get a job when he got his green card after we got married, and he told me there was a 2-year queue for it to come in. At the time, this wasn't unheard of, just a bit longer than usual, reasonable for a strange system. So yeah, he lied so he wouldn't have to get a job. Couldn't work without a green card, he got it in 6 months or so. I found out and a huge fight ensued, gave him one last chance to make it right, go get a job and get his crap together. He got an unpaid online internship. I continued my late nights at work until one evening I was driving home and just started screaming, out of the blue, just screaming and yelling at myself for what I was becoming of my life. I hated my job, I hated my home life, I hated the state I lived in. I was extremely depressed and something had to change. So I pulled over on the side of the road and just screamed at me for letting it get this bad. So I went home and we had a fight. I laid out everything and told him I wanted a divorce. It was actually a pretty peaceful divorce too. I think he knew by then that it wasn't working. But while we were in the middle of it, he knew I loved to travel but wasn't well off, so he told me that I'd never get back to Australia without his help. It just so happened that I had recently looked at a map of the world and figured out where the exact opposite part of the world was from where I was in just an idle wish to be as far away as possible. It was the ocean between Madagascar and Western Australia. With what he said and that fact, that was enough for me, so I quit my job, sold my stuff, got a year-long working holiday visa, and moved near Perth. So I suppose it worked out okay for me once it was all over. I don't think I would have had the motivation to do that if it wasn't fueled by pure spite and desperation to never be where I was again. I ended up working and traveling until my money ran out through AUS, Hawaii. I lived there for a year, across the western US, and BC, Canada. Then I moved to the place I liked most in my travels that didn't require a visa. So now I live near Seattle. I'm poor and single, renting a room with a couple of my closest friends, and extremely happy.